Welcome to the Digital Responsibility Podcast. There is a vibrant community around the world exploring how we drive forward digital innovation, products and services, and generally exploit technology progression for the sustained benefit of society and the planet. On this podcast, you will hear from me, Christopher Johnson, and Rob Price, two of the original founders of Corporate Digital Responsibility, as we speak to our guests to hear their stories and piece together what it means to be responsible in the digital age. If you'd like to learn more, take a look at the website, corporatedigitalresponsibility.net.
All right, welcome to the 10th episode of Season 4 of the Digital Responsibility Podcast. I'm delighted to be joined tonight by Arthur Gwagwa from the Netherlands at the moment, but Arthur, I'll let you kind of describe how you got to where what you're doing in the Netherlands. And for the second time in a row, Josh, welcome.
Thank you.
Keen to kind of keep you in the loop on this mini-series as part of the season where we're talking about tech bias especially. But Arthur, over to you. Tell us a bit about yourself. Introduce yourself to the listeners.
I started off as a lawyer, a human rights lawyer in Zimbabwe during the Mugabe era, late 90s, when human rights violations were climaxing in Zimbabwe. And then by chance or coincidence, around about 2013, I got into human rights and technology. In fact, I was recruited by Carly Neist, or Carly Kind, who is the executive director of the Ada Lovelace Institute in London, but she was working for Privacy International then. And then we were working mostly on the right to privacy, pushing for the mandate on the right to privacy at the United Nations. And then that's how I got into technology, digital technology and human rights. And then when artificial intelligence started to become a hot topic around about 2017, I also started looking at the ethical implications of artificial intelligence in addition to digital rights. Then I also realized, well, I need to know about the conceptual framing or the theoretical foundations of what I'm talking about. That's how I ended up working in philosophical ethics of technology at Utrecht University here in the Netherlands.
And that timing is so similar. I think when the first time that we spoke, I started talking about digital ethics and the impact on broader society very much around 2016, kind of at the time of, I guess, questions that were beginning to be asked around the impact on democracy, Cambridge Analytica, the elections in the US, the Brexit vote in the UK. So similar times. And how did you find it? What that trigger in 2013 that started you focusing more on the technological impact on human rights and democracy? Were there specific events at that time that triggered that? Why then?
I think that's when the United Nations and also civil society across the world began to realize that authoritarian governments were beginning to take a hold on the cyberspace. It became a new battleground for human rights violations. But it wasn't just applying to traditional authoritarian countries. That's when we had the riveting disclosures by Edward Snowden about the NSA and also the UK programs on surveillance. So it really became a hot issue among human rights practitioners at Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Privacy International, about a few other organizations in the United States. So Edward Snowden revelations, I think, actually became a trigger.
Okay, cool. And you've had like a long history now working for like digital ethics. Now you're in philosophical ethics. and you just touched upon like Edward Snowden and that type of thing. What would you say was like the biggest shock to you coming into this industry in terms of things that weren't in place that you thought would have been? What would you say was the biggest one that was like, I can't believe this is not a thing in regards to like digital ethics or philosophical ethics?
I think back then, because our understanding of human rights, or maybe even I think technology governance, was sort of like, I think, in black and white. We thought maybe the perpetration of human rights was coming from China, Russia, and the like-minded regimes. But I think the Edward Snowden case spotlighted that I think the issue of human rights violations sometimes also happens in established democracies. So I think for me it was also a beginning of us beginning to also focus on the big tech, because the big tech, I think if we look at the development at the United Nations, we used to talk about state surveillance. We used to talk about state obligation to protect human rights. So the language of responsibility of the big tech wasn't quite there yet. But 2013, 2014, and then 2015, when Navi Pillay was the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So the language of the big tech, because we used to think that the big technology companies are our saviors for the future. So it was the the conspiracy or their unholy alliances they were having with governments, producing technologies or deploying technologies that violate human rights, was a wake-up call for the human rights community.
And I think I remember at the same time working for a European organization, very much watching Europe react to big tech in the US, thinking needed to create European capability in that space to almost ensure ability to compete with the US. But at the same time, we're also seeing now, even last week, we were reading about an organization that was seen to be involved in impacting elections in a number of countries around the world, which, as you say, it wasn't necessarily any one place. It was Africa, it was Europe, it was US, etc. So I'm interested to know how things are perceived, or if things are perceived differently in terms of certainly what you've seen in the Netherlands and in a European view from, for example, when you were in Africa. So how's big tech and the impact seen? Is it something to fear? Is it something that can be controlled? Is it something to be better governed? Is there a difference in terms of how Africa versus Europe looks at it, for example?
I think Africa has been slow to realize the impact of technology on not just society, but human rights and the way we live generally, because I think most of the technology gadgets, like the Apple products or maybe Huawei products, were more like, I think, shiny toys for their autocrats, their and the middle class in Nairobi, in Johannesburg, and the big cities in Africa. But we were slow in responding to the negative impact of those technologies, because I think there was a shared understanding between the middle class and even autocratic regimes that technology is good for us, the vision for the future, that we are now able to communicate, we are now able to and then also, I think when you're looking at the right to privacy, I think it was European countries have been so much alive to the right to privacy. And then in Africa, most human rights defenders normally talk about privacy is not relevant to us. But then we are beginning to see the intricate link between privacy and security, that I think is not just violation of privacy, but violation of privacy leads to consequences, bad consequences, even I think fatal consequences, where the information that is mined by autocratic governments can actually be used to track dissidents or to to persecute people in the offline world. So yeah, Africa is beginning to awaken to the negative impact of these technologies, but only now.
And whose responsibility do you think it is to minimize those negative impacts? Is it individual governments? Is it a global body like the UN or the European Commission? Or who do you see as being able to make the most significant positive impact?
Yeah, I think obviously it should be the United Nations, but also other norms and standard setting bodies like the African Union. But as we know, the United Nations, I think probably I'm going to address this later, that sometimes it is ineffective because I think the very countries that are whose governments are in concert with the big tech that are exporting these maybe technologies that human rights violating are the ones that have got normative leadership at the United Nations. So it really becomes, I think, tricky for us to exclusively rely on the United Nations. But I think also at the United Nations, we began to see, like 10 years ago, the fragmentation in terms of normative approaches to the governance of technologies. So that brings about polarization between the human rights respecting countries and those that insist on what is called the state-centric model of technology governance. But I think the European Union as well has a role to play, because currently and globally, it's only the European Union that has the leverage and the agency to govern Silicon Valley and Shenzhen, because it's only the European Union right now that has got a raft of laws that is clawing back on the power of big tech. So the European Union has to keep on insisting when it is defending the European space. I think it should also expand that mandate to defend the global space. Then I think finally, when you look at the European Union, I think some of the technologies that are human rights violating come from the European Union, especially the biometric dual use technologies. The European Union should strengthen its dual use regulation in order for it to rein on the European companies that are exporting dual use technologies to Africa that might be used for human rights violations.
Just on the point of the European Union, I mean, you're right, obviously, with the introduction of GDPR a number of years ago, DMA, DSA, AI regulations on their way, etc. Then clearly kind of there is a stance that's being taken. I think by the end of last year, it was something like 3 billion in fines across 217 different organizations that have been fined. Will that and I'm asking the lawyer in you in terms of that, do you think that will be successfully enforced? There's a debate, isn't there, around those organizations having effectively the power to defend and fight those fines, and therefore is it a deterrent that will truly have an impact because it can be enforced, or is it something that's just making people think twice, perhaps?
I think the big fines, they sound okay in principle, but I think there's the issue of enforceability. But also, I think it's only now when the big technology companies are beginning to experience a decline in profits. But I think let's talk about maybe 2 years ago. Some of these fines, maybe even I think 100 million, meant nothing to Facebook back then, or to Google, or to TikTok, or some of these big technology companies, because they are like premiership footballers, they with humongous amounts of money. I think let me just maybe draw parallels. I think the premiership footballer who gets fined for a foul, maybe 20,000, for example, someone who's playing for Chelsea or Manchester United. That's more like, I think, a drop in an ocean. So the fines, I think for me, yes, sound good in principle, but I think what is also actually needed is who is benefiting from those fines. So those fines actually go on to support big economies like the UK or the European Union or the United States. So if the fine goes to the United States, for example, it is simply money that is going back to the same country that is causing, the problems. So I want to see a situation where the fines that are being levied against, the big tech, benefiting the most vulnerable markets in Africa and in Asia. But we need more measures. I think we need teeth. We need more stricter regulations in terms of controlling the big tech, in addition to the fines.
That aligns really well with the CDR principles, in the sense that key to principle 1 is advocating for better regulation that ensures people are beginning to react. Let's switch though to some of the research and the work that you're doing now. So it'd be good to hear a bit more about how you're collaborating, who you're working with, what you're finding out, and especially thinking about as you said earlier on, getting into that philosophical kind of side of use of technology and some of the ethical decision making around that.
Yeah, currently I'm working on a number of papers. So what we do is we have got a consortium of Dutch researchers, which I'm part of, where we look at the ethics of socially disruptive technology. So it's called ESTED. So what we basically do is to look at how these emerging technologies, about 60 emerging technologies, from machine learning to artificial intelligence, to biomimicry, to synthetic biology, how these technologies are disrupting not only, I think, our social lives, but the concepts and the values to which we appeal when we appeal to, moral thinking and reasoning. So yeah, so one of the issues that I'm looking at is, issue of, political agency, but also self-determination, not just of individuals, but of groups of people in the digital era. How is social media changing, self-determination? How algorithm infrastructure is changing the whole issue about self-determination? Because we've been seeing in the context of the global south, a lot of digital foreign interference. You spoke about Cambridge Analytica at the beginning, but it's much more, I think, serious than that, because I think the issue of domination or digital foreign interference is simply more than what Cambridge Analytica did. It's about how markets are changing. It's about how value chains are being reconfigured. The economic realm, the social realm, the political realm, how they are being configured by big data in combination with algorithms. So what I'm doing is, to look at that from a philosophical angle to see, I think, what sort of values, the value of unity in Africa, the value of Ubuntu, the value of harmony and consensus in our society, how those values are being appended by, the introduction of big tech, especially the agentic powers, because they've got power of agency to make decisions of consequences. And in most serious situations, they can actually not just, replace human agency, but gatekeep decisions of consequences in elections and other political events. So that's what I'm investigating at the moment. But also how nations should relate to each other in the future, especially the current geopolitical positioning and repositioning, the pursuit of strategic autonomy, the pursuit of dominance in the digital. What does it mean for the future world? How should nations relate to each other? So one of the papers I'm working on currently for the University of Munich, I'm working with Bev Townsend, my friend, who is based at the York University and at Oxford University. We are talking about how Africa should respond to geopolitical positioning between China, the United States, and the European Union, that Africa should remain non-committal, should remain neutral, and should defend, I think, the future of self-determination in the digital in light of the pursuit for domination by the big powers.
It's fine. It was so the things you talked about, they are so vast, so broad. Where do you start? Like, where do you begin with that research? What's your first point that you go to? Because I can imagine when you start in one place, it can just lead you to like a cascade of multiple different places. So how do you zone in on what to focus on initially and then go from there?
I think what I did with my supervisors, Jory Anderson and Dorothea Gadeka, we said, well, we debated for weeks. What's the most important value among Africans, and including African diaspora, the Caribbean and African Americans? So we examined political discourse from the time of Du Bois, that is when he was writing 100 years ago, Kwame Nkrumah, and then what we call African philosopher kings, like, Senghor of Senegal, Kenneth Kaunda. What did they used to talk about? So they used to talk about unity, that African people should be united, they should work together. So my starting point, actually, one of my starting points was to visit Ghana, where slavery began, where we found a number of big eminent philosophers like Kwasi Wiredu and Kwame Gyekye. And so I spoke to Ghanaians, say, what exactly do you value? Or some said consensus, some said harmony. Southern Africa, they said Ubuntu. And then I sort of I think looked at a baseline of all those philosophers and the interviews that I was doing. And then I realized that Africans pride in unity, in doing life and doing politics in unity. So that was my starting point. And then I looked at how technologies like biometric and data-centric technologies are fragmenting unity, how they are undermining unity, how they are causing or amplifying ethnic tensions and tearing communities apart in the Kenyan elections, but in South Africa, now in Nigeria, how the Huawei technology is undermining the ethos of unity and harmony in African communities. So that was my starting point, talking to Africans, especially Ghanaians, and also in South Africa, which is sort of the cradle for humankind.
Okay, that's really cool. You briefly touched, because I'm Nigerian myself, so when you were speaking, I was just like, I know exactly what you're talking about. Like, I know the emphasis they have on culture and unity, but also I know the discourse they have when it comes to things like politics and that kind of stuff. So it's really interesting to hear that.
Yes, because I think when you look at today, the Asian Nickel, which is one of the publications in Asia, I was interviewed about the role of Huawei in the current forthcoming Nigerian elections, how technology is appending the democratic landscape. So I was alongside my friend Valentin Weber at the German Council of Foreign Relations. I was interviewed to give an opinion on how Chinese technology is going to change to impact on the course and outcome of the elections. So yes, Nigeria is very, very important because we've got very important philosophers from Nigeria too, like Ife Menkiti, but Uchenna Okeja, who is one of the contemporary philosophers who speaks about agency, deliberative agency. And then I connect that, what Uchenna Okeja's deliberative agency, to technologies to see how deliberative agency is being undermined by modern technologies.
It's a brilliant introduction into a favorite topic of the last week or so in some of the conversations I've had, which has been around AI in the context of large language models. And the debate that we were having the other night was thinking about how those models have been fed in the context of materials. So the internet, Wikipedia, books, etc. But of course, the majority of that material has been English from a language point of view. And of course, an identity of a country or a culture or a group of countries is not simply the set of language that's used in a book, it's also kind of many more things, some of which we've just been talking about there. So I'm interested in, I'd just been to Norway last week. So there are 5 million Norwegians who speak Norwegian. So how is that as a language represented in the context of, as people start to use large language models to assist, accelerate, enable the delivery of whatever it might be, either in an enterprise or in life or things like that. I'm interested in your perspective, I guess from both an Africa point of view, but absolutely in the research that you're doing. How do we find a path through that in terms of maintaining diversity of culture and thought in an age of mass adoption of AI, whether large language models or otherwise? On one hand, I would imagine that technology is a way to preserve that, conscious of disappearing languages on a regular annual basis. But at the same time, I also have a fear of homogenization. We all kind of end up at the same end point. What's your thoughts on that area?
When I think the current debate on GPT or DALL-E and all that, I think it's been ongoing. I think about 4 months ago we were talking about sentient, where the AI has become sentient. So I know it's very exciting to Europeans, and yeah, it is a good development that we've got huge language models, that can, change, the way we do things. Because I think I can imagine, I think the generation of our children, I think, won't really be focusing on some of the skills that we need today. I think things are going to become easier in the same way when Google search engine was introduced. Probably, I think we're having the same debate. That's, the positive. But I think that the negative is it has got more to do with at level at which the debate is happening, because the debate on huge language models is happening at Eurocentric level. It's questioning and poking the values, European values, whether those models embody the European values, which is got more to do with the liberal individual, autonomy, explainability, and stuff like that. But do those values truly capture African values about maybe the metaphysics of human being? So I think for the Africans, we have to start questioning that the large language models, you've got agency, they've got certain level of agency in terms of what they perform, in terms of their cognitive abilities. But in whose image are they created? In terms of culture, in terms of language, but in terms of issues they articulate. So they are simply perpetuating, I think, the issues that we're talking about in their past 20 years: digital divide, data divide, and then the inclusion of African data sets. So the inclusion of African data sets also includes the inclusion of culture and the inclusion of values. So the challenge I think that we have with the large language models is, as Africans, is should we even be involving ourselves in the current debate, because it is pitched, I think, at the wrong level. Because I think what we need to do is, I think, to go back to when we were talking about how data sets and training data support these machine learning models. That's where we need to go back, because the agents, the new socially interactive agents that we are talking about, do not in any way represent African conception of personhood. So where do we go? Either as Africans we simply embrace the English language as a universal language and say, well, fair and fine, there's no way every African language is going to be embodied in the digital, or we fight our way to say, well, perhaps we need a reflection of our own languages for language preservation. It's an interesting problem because English as a language is an African language. I know it's contested, but it's a language that we adopted, centuries ago. So I think at the end of the day, maybe the focus shouldn't just be on language, should be on values. That's what I think. It should be on values, not just on language.
I mean, it's a massive topic, isn't it, Josh? It comes back to your point of it is so all-encompassing. It is so expansive that not only where do you start, but actually what do you do next to make a bigger difference? So I guess that's probably my final question, Arthur. What next? What's the key thing that you'll be looking at over the next year or two as part of your continued journey to make a positive impact in this this new world that we're in, which is kind of a highly digital, highly tech, impacting far broader than kind of just the businesses in terms of its adoption, but all of us from a societal point of view? What's your next thing?
I think these are big issues that can be addressed at a high macro level, meso level, but also I think micro level. I think at a big political organization level, I think what is actually needed is for African governments, to stop politicking or taking positions that protect their narrow political interests and begin to invest in collective agency or arguments that preserve, the self-determination of African groups. And the self-determination of African nations and groups should not necessarily be against, I think, what I call interference. Interference, maybe to say, well, we don't like English language, we don't like, the British, or we prefer the Chinese, or we don't like this country. I think that's the level of politics. But where we need to go as Africans is at a time when most countries or blocs are either fighting for strategic autonomy or for domination in cyberspace. European Union with its big tech, America with its own big tech. Africa should be thinking about a future of how to attain digital strategic autonomy, or which bloc to align itself with. I think the European Union is coming up with a very impressive legislation at the moment, which if I think Africans were to align themselves with the European Union and improve on those laws, I think the Brussels effect can actually have a positive impact in the world. So we want an Africa that is not just taking self-interested political positions to say, oh no, we don't want interference, because the digital world needs interdependence. We cannot talk of independence or non-interference, but what we need to talk about is non-domination, and non-domination is not actually being echoed in the African Union discourse at the moment.
I would just like to say, probably I can speak for everyone listening, thank you for giving us your time and basically speaking to us today. I feel like it's been a really insightful conversation. I've learned a lot. And I just want to ask, where can people hear from you, hear about your work or what you're doing? Like, where's the rest of Arthur's work going to be so we can keep up with your studies and your research?
Part of the ethics of socially disruptive technologies, which is one of the biggest research consortium here in Holland. So I think if you go on ethics of socially disruptive technologies, and then maybe the acronym and then .NL, that's where you find most of the work that we are doing. Well, if you follow me on LinkedIn as well, under Arthur Gwagwa, I post most of the stuff that I'm doing, and there's a very active community of philosophers and ethicists of technology within my circles. Thank you.
Thank you.